Hey folks, Amy here. Welcome back to our final day of the Business of Yoga speaker series. I'm really chuffed today to be speaking with Philip Goldberg, who I've just got to hold it up straight away, the author of this book and others. Phil, I know that you and I have spoken and you've shared some information with my community before, but there's a whole bunch of people who might not have seen you yet and might not have even read your book yet. So it's so wonderful to have you here. Imagine that. And to have you as a part of our series. It's a real delight. Thank you.
I am honored to be with you, Amy.
I'm going to read out your official bio so that for those unlucky folks who have yet to encounter you, they can get a sense of what you're about. Philip Goldberg has been studying India's spiritual traditions for more than 45 years as a practitioner, teacher, and writer. He is the author of numerous books, including Road Signs on the Spiritual Path and the award-winning American Veda. From Emerson to the Beatles to yoga and meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West. Can you tell that I'm a fan of this book? Look at the things on it. Which has been named one of the top 10 religion books of 2010 by Huffington Post and the American Library Association. He co-hosts the podcast Spiritual Matters. He blogs regularly on the Huffington Post and Spirituality and Health Online. He's currently working on a biography of Yogananda. I want to hear more about that. And you can find him at philipgoldberg.com and americanveda.com. Phil, so good to be speaking with you again.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Amy.
Yeah, you bet. I know that in the lead up to this interview, one of the things we've been sort of emailing backwards and forwards about is, well, what could we talk about? Because you're not a yoga teacher. And I just want to say nonsense to that from the get-go. All that you do and share and your own journey and teachings and studentship. Of course you're a yoga teacher.
Well, you're kind of right, but in the way that term is used now, it usually refers to people who teach asanas.
Yes.
And I don't do that. I practice them, but I don't teach them. I was trained as a meditation teacher, 40 some odd years ago, and that should count as yoga, but people don't think of it that way. It's the heart of yoga if you really think about it. So in a sense, I am a yoga teacher, but the term has come to mean something I'm not.
I was reading Mark Singleton's book and he talks about yoga as a homonym. Like there's kind of the yoga, modern postural yoga, as most people that might not be zealots think of it. And then there's all that is yoga. And we do use these terms interchangeably. I think that's an interesting way to put it.
It is, and it's in part a semantic thing, but it's more than that. It's the very popularity of hatha yoga and asana practice has meant sort of without people intending for that to happen, it's kind of come to define yoga, and people, great many people. I've even done it. Look at the subtitle of my book, the one you just mentioned. It says yoga and meditation in it. Yeah. And, and I hated having to separate those two things because meditation is yoga and, it's one of the 8 limbs and the heart of everything. And used to be considered, that asana was very subordinate to meditation. And not subordinate, but sort of a preliminary practice leading into meditation. And so, but now people don't think of meditation as yoga. They sort of separate it out, and that's kind of unfortunate. So it would be nice if people had the bigger picture of what yoga really is, sort of yoga, capital Y.
Yes.
And
Can you tell us a little bit about your being a meditation teacher at 40-something years ago? Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, my personal path started in the late 80s. I sound so old, but, because, it's like you turn around and you realize that you're talking about 1967 and that was 50 years ago. But that's, that era of the counterculture of the 60s. I was part of that, and part of the scene was for people who were serious about life, a new exposure to the teachings that came to us from India, including Buddhism and the Hindu traditions and the yogic ideas and practices. And I just took to it, you know, the proverbial duck to water, and got really immersed in it. And in 1970, I became a teacher of transcendental meditation. I was trained by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who at the time was probably the most famous guru in the world, because the Beatles had, you know, studied with him and gone to India to be with him. And, you know, everything exploded at that time. As you know, because you saw my Beatles presentation last year. And I was part of that. And so I decided to become a meditation teacher, because it had transformed, the practice had transformed my life in a dramatic way. And I thought, well, I want to share this. And so I became a teacher, and I did that for a few years in the 70s before turning primarily to writing as a career.
I remember when I was enjoying very much the Beatles presentation that you have. You had a photo, one of those slides was a picture of you at that time. It was fantastic.
Should we put it up? No. No, I do. That's become part of my presentations, not just the Beatles presentations, but when I give historical overviews. And just so your readers, your listeners or viewers know, I talk about how after the Beatles went to India, the demand for yoga and meditation was so extraordinary that the gurus had to start training Westerners in larger numbers to meet the demand. And in my case, I chose to become a teacher of transcendental meditation. And a lot of the young people who he was training were ex-hippies and, you know, radical kids. And so he wanted us to look more mainstream. And so there was a dress code, and we had to cut our hair and shave our beards, and we had to look like librarians, you know, but, you know, it was strategic. And so I came across a picture of me from those days with a, you know, full head of curly black hair and a suit and tie. And I show it in my presentations to illustrate the point I was making. And very few people realize it's me.
Well, also, it's an unlikely, if people in the modern day, if you think about what a yoga person looks like, and you don't think that they look like suit and tie, it's not what comes to mind.
That's right. Right. But that, you know, we were meditation teachers, and we wanted to mainstream the practice and not just, you know, teach hippies and college students. And when the research on meditation started to mount, research findings, it started to be picked up by the mainstream. And so, you know, the idea was to look sane and normal, and, you know, like you might be a professor or something, and not, you know, just some ragtag hippie. So a bunch of, you know, we didn't have any money, so we had to go to thrift shops and get boots that didn't fit well, or rip off clothing from our parents.
So this is interesting. If you take it from it, this is an interesting marketing choice from,
that's, you know, right, one of
the original.
Very good. The business of yoga. No. When I got your information, I thought, well, there is a historical perspective here, because not just Western people who were trained to teach yoga and meditation and all these practices, but the gurus themselves had to think about the business of yoga.
Totally.
And I'm doing this biography of Yogananda now, and he came to the West in 1920 and died in 1952. And that whole 32 years, he was concerned about money.
And building a business, really.
And building an organization, an institution.
Yeah.
He did not like it. I mean, I'm not demeaning him in any way. He would rather have been, you know, communing with God than, you know, running an organization and having to worry about paying the bills, especially, his organization, you know, was really started to take off in the 1920s, and then came the Depression. and they had land and, you know, expenses, and it was very, very difficult, as it was for every enterprise, most enterprises in the Western world, in America. And so it was a struggle, and you see it in his talks and his letters. You know, how do we make ends meet? And he, you know, and he was trying to put his organization on a solid footing for the future, right up to the last weeks of his life.
So for anybody who's feeling, oh, I just can't make a go of this, if Yogananda had these problems, then it's okay. This is not abnormal.
Right. Well, and, you know, and it was true of most of them. You know, the period I just mentioned in the late 60s, there was this big demand. And teachers, I know Swami Satchidananda had been teaching in an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Well, now there was big demand, so they wanted to get bigger space, and they bought a townhouse in Greenwich Village, which is still the Integral Yoga Institute headquarters. Yeah. But, you know, they had to raise money, and some celebrities came through, and then, you know, in subsequent years, they too, you know, they wanted to buy land, they wanted to have a retreat center, they too had, you know, to worry about money. Maharishi, when, you know, I became a TM teacher, it was a kind of boom time, but you also he had to think about establishing centers in new places, paying bills, and, you know, this is not what they were trained to do.
Yeah.
These guys were not, you know, Harvard Business School. They were trained in an ashram in India.
Yeah.
But they had suddenly, you know, growth and expansion has its challenges. And so, you know, it's one thing for a yoga teacher now to say, how am I going to make a living? But the yoga entrepreneurs, even the ones who seem enviably successful, you know, they have to be corporate executives in a certain way.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily their inclination. You know, and I relate to that as, you know, I've been a writer most of my adult life, and most writers I know, like me, you know, we're not business oriented. Artists, writers, people like yoga teachers, you know, they're service oriented, and they want to do work that is satisfying and work that does good for other people and, you know, makes contribution. And sometimes the personality that's required to run a business is a different kind of fit.
I remember reading
partnerships are a good idea.
That's right. I remember reading a Vivekananda biography, and the two things that stuck out in this conversation was sort of, he arrived in America with nothing, a fancy outfit, but that's about it. And then I remember a passage where he had been picked up to be a speaker on a speaker circuit, and they were underpaying him so much, and he was, you know, getting taken all over the country to do these talks, yoga talks, and not being well paid for it. And I thought, well, gee, that still happens.
You know, people see when after American Veda came out, for the next 2 or 3 years, I was getting speaking invitations all over, and people look at my schedule and think I must be, you know, getting rich. I must be selling tens of thousands of books, and people must be paying me to give these talks. No, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like that. It was like, oh, you know, okay, I'll show up, and, you know, you're covering my expenses. So, you know, that it's always like that, but people do it out of a spirit of service, and that doesn't necessarily make you a good negotiator.
Well, for someone like Vivekananda, it was like, well, whose house can I stay at, and who's going to make my meals?
Yeah, and the same is true of all the gurus. The very early stages, like, you know, I'll tell you about Maharishi Mahesh Yogi again, because I knew him so well. But, you know, when I was involved, he was world famous. But his story is that, you know, when he first showed up in America, his first public lecture was in his room at the YMCA.
Wow.
In Honolulu, on his way to America. And then, you know, And Yogananda too. Yogananda, you know, checked into a YMCA in Boston when he got off he had come here to speak at a conference. And then, you know, somebody invited him to speak at a church afterward. And then somebody invited him to speak here. And, you know, maybe a few people showed up. But then after a while, he was filling Carnegie Hall. So, you know, but these things can't be planned. But they all started humbly. And the truth is, for the guys coming here from India, you know, a room at a YMCA with running water might have been luxurious.
Kind of fancy. Yeah.
But, you know, they all had these humble roots. When Srila Prabhupada, who brought the Hare Krishna movement to the U.S., I mean, he was living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan with very little. You know, that's, especially in those days, that, you know, they didn't travel with a big entourage, and you know, there weren't wealthy people sponsoring them yet. So.
I think that's a fascinating thing too, in looking at all of these gurus and their journeys and how they did attract benefactors and financial backers. I find that really interesting.
That, you know, I was thinking to myself when I said, what am I going to talk about with Amy? I thought, well, one thing, people who are watching this, who are yoga teachers or yoga entrepreneurs, you're in good company. You know, all the legendary yoga gurus and everything, you know, they all started out humbly. They all had money issues, whether they were struggling or successful, whatever phase of their work, they had to deal with, you know, overhead and expenses and money things and all that. But the other thing is, I was thinking to myself, I was going to joke about it, but it's also very true. Benefactors. You know, Yogananda had a major benefactor. He had a number of people who, you know, put up money, you know, people who were doctors, businessmen, and so forth, and they would finance things and get things off the ground. When they got their first property here in LA, which is still, since 1925, their main center, you know, it required help from local LA business people to not only put up some money, but to negotiate the real estate transaction, you know, lawyers working pro bono, things like that. I mean, they all had them. And later, they were saved basically by a very wealthy businessman from Kansas City, who became not only the principal benefactor, but the principal disciple.
Wow.
And Yogananda used to call him a saint because of his spiritual experiences as well as his generosity. And he became Yogananda's successor.
Ah, right.
He only lived 3 years, so people don't know much about that. 1952 to 1955, and the person who took his place was Sri Dayamata, who was president for 55 years. So, but James Lynn was the first, and you know, if he hadn't come along when he did in the midst of the Depression and write checks and do this, Yogananda could not have expanded the way he did, or he maybe even survived. He may have had to, you know, go back to India. I mean, that's unlikely because something would have happened, but you know, it made a big difference. And that's one thing. I mean, it may not, I don't know how it comes across, but artists have always had patrons. Musicians have often had to be supported by, you know, whether the prince or the you know, the royal family. You know, look at Mozart's story and with Salieri and all that. And I mean, so there's a history of artists and teachers and wise people who have something of great value to offer, only being able to do so with the generosity of people of means.
Yeah.
And, you know, so the business model of offering a service and being paid for the class, for the hours or whatever it is, doesn't always, it's not always enough.
Mm.
And most of the gurus I've studied when I was writing American Veda, they were benefactors.
Mm.
Either a lot of small benefactors or a few major benefactors. And they were often, you know, they may have been, you know, entertainment figures, celebrities, or you know, wealthy business people, or heiresses.
Yeah.
You know, but and a lot of that kind of support was financial, and a lot of it was instigated by women. And this is, you know, something that people should know, because people going back to Vivekananda and Yogananda and all the gurus, you know, in the early days, you know, when the women had more time, and because the husbands were working, and the women were not, you know, supposed to work, and they were, if they were a family of some affluence, they were meant to have salons, they were meant to do volunteer work, and if they put their attention on doing that to a guru or swami, they made things happen. They got the husbands to write a check. They would get the rich people to come and hear him speak. They would do fundraisers. They would, you know, provide a lecture hall. They would get the hotel to give a ballroom, whatever it was. They were a lot of the energy behind making things work. And, you know, there's famous stories, especially there's one of Vivekananda's closest disciples was a woman from a New England sort of aristocracy named Sarah Bull. And when she died, her will, she gave, I wouldn't say everything, but a huge amount to Vivekananda's organization. And her daughter protested after her death. And the court ruled in the daughter's favor, because the assumption was that if somebody was crazy enough to give her money to a Indian swami, he must have hypnotized her or had some kind of, she must have been a little off. And so the benefactors have to be careful too. but it's an interesting thing, and I'm sure it comes instinctively to a lot of yoga teachers that, oh, this enthusiastic student of mine has money. Maybe they'll help.
Yeah.
Maybe, or they'll sponsor a fundraiser, or maybe they'll invest in my business, or whatever it is. It's a natural instinct, and we can sometimes, you know, make ourselves say and do things we don't necessarily approve of, you know, by being a little too solicitous or something. But it's a legitimate thing to think of benefactors. I'm sure there's a lot of yoga teachers who have them.
And if not in the here's my estate kind of way, definitely I know my teachers, when they're traveling the world, they've got big name yoga brands, and they're still sleeping on the fold out couch of whoever is hosting them at their studio. There's still that, very much that element to it.
Sure. But benefactors, some, you know, there's also the nonprofit model of you know, paying yourself a salary and getting people who will contribute, and it would be advantageous tax-wise. I mean, there's, you know, and then there are people who just want to help somebody who is doing important work in the world and be part of that. And that happens a good deal. I'm sure the yoga teachers listening know examples of that, and they have been helped that way themselves. But, you know, the really lucky ones, like writers and artists who get patrons who, you know, help more than just help, but essentially make it possible for them to do what they do. Yoga teachers, it is something that should be part of the equation.
Well, and these days we see it in things like you know, the kirtan artist has a Kickstarter campaign, and so it's the model now is we've got new tools of having a similar outcome. All true.
But, you know, the yoga teachers now are often, you know, it's not like being Yogananda or a Maharishi or a Swami whoever, you're one of thousands of yoga teachers.
At least.
You know, who becomes, you know, Shiva Ray or whoever, you know, I don't know that there's a formula or a way to plan for that. It's karma. And that's part of it. And not everybody is going to make a living at it. So, you know, that's another part of the equation.
That sometimes it can be something that you do as a passion project, if you like, in your life. It doesn't have to be the way that you find financial means.
I know. And, you know, I can again draw an analogy to writing. There's a lot of people who have talent as writers or musicians, and they may want to be professionals, but they may not have either enough talent or the instinct for what might be sellable. There's a lot of very talented people who are you know, gifted artists and writers. It's just not commercial. And as we all know, there's a lot of mediocre people who are very commercial. I mean,
it's true. Yeah, it's true.
It's the truth.
Yeah.
And the same could be true of yoga teachers.
Yes, absolutely.
An ordinary yoga teacher could get very lucky and have the right charisma or personality or timing or the right connection to a benefactor or whatever it is. So a lot of this is karmic, and a lot of it involves skills that are not necessarily what you train to do in a yoga, you know, to become a yoga teacher or a writer or an artist. And for some people, it's just not going to be a profession. It may be an avocation. It may be a part-time thing. It may be, you know, there's a lot of writers who would never have been able to get published, and now they're self-publishing. So at least they can do that and have that means of self-expression, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll make a living. And a yoga teacher can find students to teach, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be their profession. And that's just a fact of life that people have to be aware of. There may not be enough demand for all the, you know, supply of teachers.
I think you make a great point, and I want to come back to it in a second. Before we totally move away from the benefactor thing, Phil, because this stuff, I'm so curious about this.
Yeah, send your checks to Amy McDonald.
There's also the risk that happens for a guru who has a benefactor and then they fall out. There are some, you know, these ones. The Theosophical lady, society woman.
Madame Blavatsky.
Yes, like what happens when you're really into someone and then actually, you know what, you're not my guy anymore. And so there's that too.
Yeah, it could happen. I suppose, and I'm sure there are examples of that.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the main benefactor, you know, has a turn in the stock market and or dies. You know, anything can happen.
Yeah. So, I bought a book the other day, Phil. I was thinking of you when I bought it, this huge, big storybook of Krishna. It was from one of Prabhupada's books, and I bought it because it's got a forward from George Harrison, and I'm like, I've got to get that. It's fantastic. Can we talk a little bit about American Veda? Because I'm a zealot for this book. I love it. My community's been reading it as our book club last month. Tell us about why did you decide? Because this is no small project. Why did you decide to do this? Why did you decide to do this?
Well, the story is, as we said earlier, I've been in this world of East coming to the West for, you know, almost 50 years. And I saw, you know, over time, you know, it obviously transformed my life and the life of many people I knew, and I just saw it, the influence of India's spiritual heritage and the yoga tradition just sort of spreading throughout the culture. And in the mid 80s, I said, boy, this is bigger than I realized. And by then I was writing professionally, and I thought maybe there's a book in it. And I started gathering material, and we couldn't sell it, couldn't get a publisher interested in the mid 80s, one or two, but editors interested and saw the truth behind what I was proposing. But it wasn't as obvious to people, and it never happened. And I just sort of put it away. But I kept noticing it's just spreading more. It's reaching into different corners of the culture. It's affecting more and more people, more and more categories of people. And it's permeating. And I just kept gathering material. And then in 2005, the timing was perfect. And an editor at Random House had the similar idea and mentioned it to my agent, as it happens. And my agent said, well, as it so happens, client. And she put us together. And the book was different from what I had proposed in the 80s because things had changed. But by then, you know, it was a lot more obvious that there was the influence of India's spiritual culture had really had a big impact on America. There were even data and studies to prove the point. Wow. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And I got, you know, Random House made an agreement, a contractual agreement. And I set out to write it. And no one told me it was going to take 2 years longer than I planned. But it did. And eventually, you know, came out. But it was a passion of mine. I mean, it was just, you know, I hate to say things like this, but it was just sort of meant to be. You know, this book had to be written, and it was, you know, I was the right person, I suppose, to do it. There are similar books out there, but we all have our different takes on it. And similarly with the Yogananda book, you know, after American Veda came out, I made a list of about 10 ideas that would be a good follow-up book. And the one that really resonated with people was the biography of Yogananda once I investigated and found out no one had really done it.
I've just picked up the biography written by his brother. I have yet to read it, but I think I'm looking for
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a sweet book, and it's a good source. It was a good source for me. Yogananda's younger brother, Sananda Ghosh, wrote a book about his brother, whose nickname, so to speak, family name was Mejda, and it's a very good source because, you know, he's telling mostly family stories. You know, and he tells more about Yogananda's young years and his family than Yogananda does in his autobiography of a yogi. Well, not more necessarily, but some of his stories are different. You know, things that Yogananda didn't include. So it's a charming book, but it doesn't say much about the years after Yogananda left India and came to America, which is what I mostly focus on.
Yeah, I'm really, April, everybody, look out for it in April. I'm going to be talking about it because I imagine it'll have just as many tabs as this one does by the time I get my hands on one. Phil, I can't wait. You know, it's thinking about Yogananda and the Self-Realization Fellowship, and like even just if you think about that as a business now, the property that they own, I mean, I can't even imagine what the value and things like how do you upkeep of it, and they still have their correspondence course, right? They're still mailing stuff out to people.
They just announced the other night, Friday night, it's now Saturday, last night, my time, that they've been working on revising that correspondence course, and next year sometime there'll be a new version of it. But I always say that Yogananda had the best real estate karma of all the gurus. And people who have been to their property, mostly in Southern California, but also, you know, there are places in India, places in other parts of the world. They're just beautiful locations, and very well put together. And here in LA, where I am, their original property, what's called the Mother Center, is still there on a hilltop near downtown LA. People who are in America know about the Lake Shrine in Pacific Palisades, their property in Encinitas, their temple and center in Hollywood. They just somehow did
make good choices.
Well, yeah, and they're, as you suggest, developers would, pay through the teeth.
Can you imagine? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. All right. So I claim yoga teacher as a title for you, even though you might not. And one of the ways that you teach is by the writing of books for people that are watching and thinking, what's that doctor? I've got a book in me. What's that, the thing that people feel the compulsion that there's something to share and I think it's a book. What would you have to say about writing a yoga book and having it published?
Well, I actually, in the past, I used to consult a lot to people who wanted to get published. And I actually had an audio recording online about how to write a book proposal. But things have changed with the advent of the web and ebooks and self-publishing being not only an easy thing to do, but a no longer disreputable thing.
Yes.
It's not considered denigrating to have self-published a book as it was in the past. And so the formula is different now. The question is, do you have something new and different to say that people are going to want to read in a very, very busy, crowded marketplace on and about yoga, or by yoga teachers and about yoga? There are scholarly books. There are self-help books and very commercial books. There's yoga for this and yoga for that and yoga for everything. And every once in a while, because I have a podcast, Spirit Matters podcast, and I write and blog, so I get PR announcements. Oh God, another yoga book. Every once in a while, there's something I'll say, oh, that's a different angle. That's a different take. That may have value. So people have to, think not only what do I have to offer, what's my expertise, but is the angle I'm taking, is there a niche for me in the marketplace? And you may be that there's other books that are like it and similar, but it doesn't mean you can't find an audience as well. There's probably several books on yoga and recovery, for example, yoga and addiction, or yoga and back pain, or whatever. It doesn't mean you won't have something new to offer. And if you're not in fantasy land thinking, well, my book on yoga is going to be so great that Oprah will have me on her, cover of her magazine or whatever, and I'll make $1 million. If you're, more realistic and just say, well, it'll be a good book, and we'll see if it affects the marketplace, and I'm willing to invest the time. The benefit of having a book is not just in the income from sales of the book, but if it's a good book, it's a calling card. It shows you have some expertise, and that can lead to other things. Workshops at places where they pay. Speaking, public speaking. A second book, more clients because you're an author, more people coming to your classes. So, books can be thought of as a good calling card, but, my advice to people who want to write, whether they're yoga teachers or novelists or anything, is do it because you have a compelling inner need to express with something, and you think it'll be useful or of value, even if it's just entertainment, whatever, to a reasonable number of people.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like the publishing equivalent of not being attached to the fruits of your action.
It's exactly what it is.
Well, yes, but part of not being attached to the fruits of your action in the yoga philosophy is you do the action with integrity.
Yes.
And you do it
Best
impeccably, and you do it well, and hopefully you do it. Whatever you're doing is in line with Dharma and is in line with higher purpose and good for yourself and others. And if that's the motivation, like, I have something to offer here. And there's nothing wrong with also being a careerist and thinking, hey, it could be, I could make money or it could help my career. But the attachment shouldn't be to that. And I think, and in fact, if I have anything to say about the, business of yoga, other than what I've already said, it's be the best yoga teacher you can.
Yeah.
If and do it, treat the tradition with dignity and respect that this great tradition on, you're standing on the shoulders of a lot of brilliant and divine sages and yogis and gurus and siddhas, and we should do what we do honorably and with dignity and without distorting the teachings for the sake of making a buck. And one thing I've learned from studying all the gurus, and Yogananda is one of them, you always have to adapt the teachings to the audience, to the students who are coming, to the time that we live in, to the culture we live in. Because, 21st century America is not, 19th century India or whatever. But the adaptation should be done with integrity and not just, well, I'll get more people in the door if I use this language, or, if I tell them, my asana, I know the best asana is for improving your sex life, and I'm going to just go with that. And if you do know that and your audience is right, then fine, but don't lose sight of what yoga really is.
I love it.
And the fullness of it, and do it with integrity, because in the long run, that's going to serve you. Yoga teachers should know something about karma.
This is just the perfect bookend to, we started the series with Kia Miller talking about, if you're looking for prosperity and abundance, it comes when you're in alignment with what you're about, when you've done your apprenticeship with your teacher, when you're really living what it is that you're sharing, and the integrity. And that's what I'm hearing you say as well.
Absolutely. And because if people, and it's it happens out there, you see signs of it. When people start distorting the teaching, compromising on the teachings, diluting the teachings in order to attract customers, or in order to churn out more yoga teachers quickly without proper training, eventually it's going to taint yoga in general, and it's going to there'll be a backlash. And any yoga teacher who has a scandal or is caught doing the wrong things or whatever, it has a bad mark on everything from the other studio who's doing it the right way down the street to the whole history of this tradition. People could just say it's all a fraud, And there's enough opposition to yoga. You don't need to feed into it. And so it should be done with integrity. You know, if people are found doing anything like, you know, distorting a study on yoga, you know, to come out with certain results, or over commercializing something, making promises they can't keep, not to mention all the other reasons there are scandals and upheavals. We're all affected by that. And then people like me have to, you know, go up in front of public and answer questions.
I want to be in that lecture. So Phil, tell us about Living La Vida Yoga. What is this? Tell us.
Living La Vida Yoga. Yeah, I'm doing an online course through a wonderful website called Spirituality and Practice. And they, people should know about it. They do a lot of e-courses and webinar type of things. And it's a lovely website with a lot of resources. And it's about all the different spiritual traditions. They're all represented. I contributed to a program they did on compassion. And I did the sort of Hindu take on compassion, and other people did the Islamic and the Christian and the Buddhist and everything. And so it's a very good website. And I'm doing something called La Vida Yoga that will be a series of 12 e-courses. They're not audio or video. You get an email on 12 days with, you know, written lessons and practices, and occasionally some link to something that will help people with their practice. And it's all about integrating yoga in the big capital Y sense of the word. The sort of essence of what the yoga tradition offers, whether you know, regardless of your own path or your own tradition. You know, you could be a devoted Christian or Jew or a Muslim or whatever, but there's insights and practices from the yoga tradition that can deepen your spiritual path. And that's what it's about. And integrating these teachings into everyday life, which I'm sure everybody watching this has never had any challenge being a yogi in the world, because it all comes easy and naturally. But for the rare person who might have a challenge or two, you know, there's some advice.
Sounds fantastic. And I presume then that this is one of the ways that you like to teach is online, sharing transcripts online.
Well, I've done, you know, online webinars, audio or visual, and of course I do my podcast, Spirit Matters. We have over 100 interviews. They're all audio, but we have some great people, and some people that in the yoga world, you know, probably a disproportionate number of people in the yoga world. You know, Radhanath Swami, and we just put up an interview the other day with Sridhar Silberfein, who started Bhakti Fest. And we've had Jai Uttal. We've had a lot of people in the yoga world, but people in other traditions as well. So I like that. And I also like public speaking and doing workshops and so forth. But these days, you know, you could stay home in your dirty clothes and do an online thing. And, you know, so I kind of like that. I like, you know, contributing whatever I can. If I have, you know, one particular skill set, it's communicating verbally. So whether it's, you know, like this or in writing, it's sort of my dharma to do that.
Just on that, it's one of the things I love about American Veda is that it's so readable. It's story, just highly like crazy informative, but so pleasurable to read. I think that the way that you communicate is great. It makes things enjoyable to absorb.
You're very kind to say that, and I appreciate that a lot, because you know, I think of myself as a writer first, and, you know, the other things secondary.
So folks, go and find more about living La Vida yoga. Starts soonish, right, Phil?
September.
Okay, perfect.
2nd or something, but it'll be archived if you're late. And yes, and thank you, Amy, for doing this, and to everybody out there. I hope everybody succeeds in the business of yoga, because to me, the advent of yoga coming to the West in all of its forms and all of its larger picture is one of the most significant historical phenomena in our time. And so the more the better, and it gives me hope for spiritual and social transformation the more these ideas and practices enter the mainstream.
Yeah, beautifully put, Phil. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for your time. It's always so fun and rewarding speaking with you. So I'm super grateful.
Thank you, Amy. I'm grateful for you and the work you do. Keep it up.